Hello, coming to you from Omaha, Nebraska, home of the most exciting Black Friday board game deals on the planet. Welcome to the Out of the Dust podcast. I'm your host, Bargain Hunter Bryce. Tied in with the popular recurring Out of the Dust geek list on Board Game Geek, the Out of the Dust podcast is a weekly podcast that is focused on re-exploring games we played that we hadn't previously played in a year or more. Why did the game get dusty? Why did you decide to dust it off? How does the game compare to how you remembered it? Are you likely to play it more often in the future? These are the questions that we're interested in examining on Out of the Dust. This week on the podcast, episode 23, on the Out of the Dust segment, I'll bring Ticket to Ride Europe out of the dust, and a contributor will dust off Armada 3. On the reaction segment, I'll continue to discuss Secret Santa Etiquette. On the What I Have Been Playing segment, I review Spring Meadow. On the Obscure Bryce Games segment, I review Battle of Litz. And we wrap up the episode by continuing my top 5 food games countdown with number 4 on the list.
Oh gosh, I'm fretting up on the air
Spielbound Board Game Cafe recently had a Ticket to Ride Europe tournament that I decided to participate in. These wound up being Out of the Dust plays for me, having last played the game 1 year, 7 months, and 17 days ago. This is probably my least played Ticket to Ride map. The stations are too nice, and there aren't enough long 6-distance routes on the Europe board for my playstyle. I'm one of those guys who likes to hoard cards much of the game and then claim as many of the 6-distance routes on the USA map as possible. Often I will not even worry about additional ticket cards at all. But that strategy doesn't really work on the Europe map. You need extra tickets on the Europe map, and the stations will usually help you achieve all of them. I fancy myself a pretty good Ticket to Ride player, but I finished dead last in this tournament because I failed to make the Europe map adjustment. All the point spreads were agonizingly close, but I just couldn't make the difference-making move this time. Ah well, it was worth it to get the cool new translucent purple trains that were given out as participation prizes, though. Let's see what a contributor brought Out of the Dust. Pedro Silva, username Malgar, brought Armada 3 Out of the Dust. Published in 1988 by Eurogames and designed by Philippe de Peleris and Patrice Pellet, Armada is an action point allowance system exploration and fighting game. Pedro writes, Armada is an old game, at around 30, and has some problems that may somewhat be explained by that. The dice are too determinate because exploration, from maybe finding a rich territory with no defense to an aggressively populated one with no wealth, and combat, some combats have weird results in spite of the forces involved, which are the main activities in the game, are resolved with dice rolls. Also, the endgame conditions and victory determination may lead to turtling with successive bash-the-leader sequences until one player manages to hold on to the required territories from erosion of all others. Still, I have a soft spot for it in my heart, as it was one of the different games that I came in contact with in the 80s, and stayed in my mind, later helping to spark my dive into this hobby, and being one of the first that I think of as part of my collection. Maybe I'll try to take a stab at mitigating those problems, as I think it would be a very good game if somehow those wrinkles were ironed out through the benefit of more modern approaches to game design and player agency in the game's result. Thanks for the contribution, Pedro. Armada certainly sounds like a unique game, and I would be interested in hearing if you managed to create a successful variant for the game sometime. Reaction segment time. This week on the segment, I will continue to discuss board game Secret Santa Etiquette. Last week I talked about etiquette from the receiver's perspective. This week, let's talk about etiquette from Santa's perspective. The first thing Santa needs to do is to make sure their target has a sufficiently sized wish list to select from. Santa should not feel bad about reaching out anonymously to their target and requesting a larger wish list with additional in-print items if needed, or comments for the items on the wish list explaining why the target is interested in the game. If the target has not provided a letter to Santa, or offered up any additional information about their general board gaming tendencies and preferences, Santa should not feel bad about soliciting this information from their target either. After all of these requests will help ensure the target receives an awesome package. Now that the necessities are out of the way, let's have some fun as Santa. Now, there are all kinds of Secret Santas. Some are more active and vocal than others. But let's assume you want to be a particularly fun and awesome one. To do that, maintain communication with your target. Let them know you're browsing their list. Tease them when you've purchased a game for them. Ask them how their holidays are going. Those sorts of things. You might even question them about where they live, if they are married or have kids, what kinds of other hobbies they have. Let them know you're interested in them. This information can also be used to personalize a package for your target. You don't have to include just games as gifts. Books and movies you think they'll like make great stocking stuffers. You might also include some souvenir from your home city for them to remember you by. And of course, include some treats! There's nothing like some festive or local flavored treats to elevate a package to the next level. Speaking of the next level, here are some other ideas that I've heard of people doing. Riddles about the games being given, fun tasks to do or objectives to complete before the games are shipped, and virtual scavenger hunts that give clues about the games you're going to send. Some of these things might seem like a lot of work, but you'd be surprised at how easily they are to accomplish and how gratifying they are to do. What do you guys think? Do you have any cool suggestions for how to be the best board game Secret Santa ever? Let me know in one of the contact information methods I mentioned at the end of the episode. On the What I Have Been Playing segment this week, I'm going to tell you about Spring Meadow, the recently released final game in Uwe Rosenberg's puzzle trilogy that started with Cottage Garden and continued with Indian Summer. I've been playing it a lot in recent weeks as I run some Envoy Splash demo events celebrating its release. Thematically, this entry in the puzzle trilogy doesn't make a lot of sense. Players are hikers on a mountain wanting to have a picnic. In the snow! Maybe that's something Germans enjoy, I don't know. But picnicking in the snow is something I have personally vowed to try to avoid ever doing during the course of my life. Thematically, this is represented in the game by players drafting grass tiles to fill up their snowy mountain board. I suppose you could think of the tiles as the snow melting in a clearing for the picnic, but I prefer to think of it as the players being so desperate to have the star picnic that we're physically shoving the snow out of the way with our hands and feet. Mechanically, the game borrows a couple of elements from the earlier entries in the series. Drafting tiles is accomplished on a board similar to the one used by Cottage Garden. The polyomino tiles themselves have holes in them like the tiles in Indian Summer, and positioning the tiles over certain icons on the player board yields bonus points and later advantages. Perhaps the most interesting part of this entry in the series is how scoring works, which triggers whenever a player is about to draft a tile from a column or row with only one or less tiles to choose from. Players count the number of complete rows from the bottom up until they come to the first incomplete row. A player's score is calculated by multiplying the number of complete rows by 10, the number of spaces in the row, and adding to it the number of spaces covered up in the first incomplete row and a handful of minor modifiers. The player with the highest score earns a hiking pin, and the first player to earn 2 hiking pins wins the game. Because the scoring mechanic encourages players to fill in their board from the bottom up, tile placement is a little more restrictive than in the other entries in the series, and this is a good thing. Tile choice and placement is more important than the other games in the series, and a wonderful tension is created as scoring rounds approach and players hope to get just one more turn to place the perfect tile onto their board. Coupled with a little more interesting and challenging solo mode compared to the other games in the series, and I think Spring Meadow emerges as a slight favorite as the best game in the trilogy. I enjoy all 3 of them, but I've already got more plays logged of Spring Meadow in the short time it's been released than I do in either Cottage Garden or Indian Summer. Obscure Bryce Games segment time. I guess it's an episode of Tetris-style puzzle games because now I'm going to tell you about an obscure, abstract strategy title called Battle of Lits. That's Lits, spelled L-I-T-S. So named because those 4 letters also happen to be the shape of the 4 different Tetronimo-shaped tiles in the game. Battle of Litz was originally a self-published game by designer Grant Fikes before being published by independent publisher Nestor Games. Most notably, the game happens to be available for play on the Board Game Arena platform, which is where I originally came across it. Here's how it works. One player is the X's and the other is O's, the 2 letters being printed 30 times each on the spaces of a 10x10 grid. The objective is for a player to have the most of their letters still showing at the end of the game, which is triggered when no more legal tiles can be played. The players alternate laying the Tetronimo tiles on the grid according to the following rules. A tile must touch another tile. 2 of the same tiles cannot touch each other, and no 2x2 square can ever be covered up by any combination of tiles. The game is very strategic as players must weigh the benefit of placing pieces that either cover up opponent letters or place pieces in such a way that their own letters cannot be covered up at all due to the restrictions of the rules. Of course, the ideal play accomplishes both these things at once, but this will rarely happen in the most optimal of ways. The game is very well balanced and always seems to come down to a difference of just 1 or 2 letters showing at the end. It's an addictive game, plays quick, and offers tough, engaging decisions to make from beginning to end. There's some nice tension that is created as the board starts to fill up, and players try to outguess what each other will do next. I enjoy the game a lot. Despite its presence at a major online platform, I quite often get to add this title to the Games Only I Played monthly geek list when I log plays of it. Physical copies are very scarce, so I don't know if I will ever get to add this to my collection, but I'm always on the lookout for a copy. Last week we began a new Top 5 countdown. This time, in honor of Thanksgiving and Christmas, I started a Top 5 food games list. At position number 4, I'm going to go with Finca, a Rio Grande game from 2009 designed by Wolfgang Suttker and Ralf Zerlind, a couple of designers that don't have a whole lot of games to their credit, but are also well known for the popular I Split You Choose game, Animals on Board. Finca is notable as being one of the first modern games to feature a rondel, the spaces of which had pictures of various kinds of fruit on them. Players move one of their pieces on the rondel a number of spaces equal to the number of pieces in the space they're moving from, and collect an amount of fruit equal to the number of pieces in the space they land on. Players use this fruit to fill orders from the main section of the board. Each order is worth a certain number of points between 1 and 6, and players earn set collection points for collecting each value, and the most of each type of fruit. Speaking of fruit, the 6 different kinds each have their own sculpted meeple shape. Very unusual in a game this age, and an element that made this game a collector's item for many years, besides the quality of the gameplay itself. Today the game is ranked just outside the top 500, and after being out of print for most of its existence, it just recently came back in print earlier this year after a successful Kickstarter campaign. Rondels usually seem to provoke interesting decision-making opportunities, and Finca is no exception. Coupled with set collection, which is a mechanic I tend to enjoy, and it's easy to see why Finca is a standout title for me. I don't recommend people play it online though, where it's available at Yucata. Played live on a physical copy, the game is a brisk and engaging experience with quick, meaningful turns. But this briskness and meaningfulness does not transition well to a turn-based platform like Yucata. The game is slowed way down, and it's easy to forget what one is trying to build up for while waiting days between turns. As evidenced by other games I've mentioned over the course of past episodes, I'm a fan of many online implementations of physical board games, but Finca is not one of them. It's a far superior experience played live with a physical copy where one can also appreciate the beautiful board and wooden components. So I recommend those interested in trying the game to try to track down a physical copy for themselves, or try to find somebody who got in on the recent Kickstarter and play it with them. That's the way this particular game is meant to be played, and the experience will be much more rewarding when reserved for that method. Well, that will do it for episode 23. Thanks for listening. Feel free to